India has the largest number of malnourished people in the world in absolute millions. If the world has to get rid of poverty, if the world has to become food secure, India has to end poverty. India has to become food secure. Because in India, all said and done, it's still women who are responsible for putting the food on the table. 72% of Indians cannot afford a healthy diet. That's about 1,000 million people in India cannot afford a healthy diet. Change can come about from public action from below as well as from above. We don't wait for change only from above.
Hello and welcome to TEDx Conversations Season 3. I'm your host Chaitanya Chaudhary, and in this episode 3 of the season, we are digging deeper into the questions that shape our future, the role of technology, inclusion, equity, and the human stories behind systems and structures. Our guest today is someone whose work bridges the gap between policy and people, theory and lived experience, Professor Madhura Swaminathan. Welcome. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you.
She's an economist, professor, and head of the Economic Analysis Unit at the Indian Statistical Institute, Bangalore. With a PhD from Oxford and years of fieldwork across India, she has authored critical works like Women and Work in Rural India and Weakening Welfare. Today, we are not just learning about agriculture, we are uncovering why this space matters deeply for a generation, why food systems, rural equity, and ethical technology are not just development issues, they are survival issues, climate issues, and human issues. And why young minds, especially engineers, data scientists, and creators, need to engage not only with ideas that excite them, but with ideas that sustain the world. So, whether you have ever wondered how tech can help a farmer, how policies can ignore the visible, or how to build change that actually includes everyone, this conversation is for you. So, let's rewind to your early days, ma'am. Was there a moment, maybe a conversation, an experience, or even a challenge that set you on the path towards agriculture or rural development? And what did your world look like back then, perhaps as a resident of the Indian Agricultural Research Institute?
I grew up on the campus of the IARI, Pusa campus as it was called, which was in a corner of Delhi. Now it is in a quite built up area. But I think what was interesting about campus life is that, like any other university campus, there were students, there were young people, there were researchers, but we were also in the midst of fields. And we know, I think we just imbibed that crops had to be cared for, that there were seasons, that nature mattered. When the monsoon was starting, this was something that would be discussed. So I think there's no one moment when I decided at that young age to come into this field. But I think clearly looking back, growing up on the campus with fields and nature around you uh, has clearly influenced the kind of work that I'm doing today.
Often, people talk about turning points in their careers. Was there a particular experience or motivation or realization that changed the way you saw your work or the impact you wanted to leave?
I didn't have a eureka moment. I think I don't want to invent one. My father was a geneticist. My eldest sister went to the medical stream. So I guess I did. I started with biology in school, and at the back of my mind, there might have been a thing that I would also go for the biology stream. But I was very bad at dissection, and so I decided I have to drop out of that. And economics was something. My grandfather was an economist. I felt that in our country, where there were so many economic problems, we're a less developed country, that this was an area that would be not just interesting as an academic, but something where change was important. It was an area where India needed economists. And so I decided to start in a new subject, which was not there in school. I think I would like to add here that so I did an undergraduate in economics and I did a master's in economics. And during the masters, the end of the first year, uh, I won an award for a small research project. And in those days, uh, there weren't internships and people didn't do research projects and things in summer. We just took a holiday, maybe just catch up with your textbooks. So this was very exciting. And I went to Tehri Garhwal in the hills and stayed there for a couple of weeks. And my topic was uh, studying fuel use in the economy. But when I started looking at what fuel is being used, I found that it was mainly firewood. And when we started looking at the cost of firewood, as an economist, wanted to know what is the price and how much people are spending, it actually turned out that firewood was entirely collected by women. So there was no cash to be paid for it, but was in terms of the hours that women spent from these villages going up the hillside to forested areas and collecting and then bringing back, which is quite a drudgerous task, a whole bundle of little pieces of wood on their backs to their homes. So this
For it?
no, this is they're doing it for their own family use. So this was a total eye opener in terms of the poverty of people and the fuel that they're using, the fact that at that time a lot of men, even now in these hill areas, have migrated to towns and to the foothills to find jobs. Many had gone to the army, and it was women who were holding up the rural economy. And that this very important activity, women were not paid for it. It was unpaid labor of women. Uh, and in fact, you could say it was the first time you study in India where we measure the price of something in terms of the hours spent. So if you're spending 4 hours from early morning 6 and you come back at 10, you're not being paid a wage for that, but that is economic activity that you're doing. So I think the types of that was a kind of turning point in the sense that I was studying all kind of economics, but what is the reality of poverty in our hill economies? What is the drudgery of work? What is the contribution of women? These are many issues. Gender concerns in agriculture, we call it today. But I think these concerns, which I'm still involved with or researching, perhaps that was the first eye-opening. Yeah, yeah. Not eureka, but it is an exposure to a totally different kind of life from a city life. And that was clearly an effect, I think, on the kinds of issues I have taken up in my career.
So, moving on to the next question. Your work bridges rigorous academic research with real rural realities, as you mentioned just now. So, you have written extensively about food security, gender, and inequality. What are some of the persistent gaps in policy, technology, or social understanding that you feel most compelled to address today?
Many young people may not know
Mm.
that India has the largest number of poor people in the world. We are about 18% of the world population, and we are 32% of the chronically hungry and malnourished, the food and nutrition secure. India has the largest number of malnourished people in the world in absolute millions. Of course, we are now the largest country in population terms. We've overtaken China. So I think why I give this in the beginning is we've had many successes in India over the last, over my lifetime. Uh, Technological successes as in the agricultural revolution, many others. We have improvements in education, rising income, but there are certain persistent problems in urban and rural India, but perhaps at a bigger scale in rural India that remain.
Mm.
And these problems, I think, or let me put it different way. If the world has to get rid of poverty, if the world has to become food secure, India has to end poverty. India has to become food secure. And it's not that we've not had technologies or policies. We've had brilliant scientists, economists, many others. But I think an underlying issue has not been addressed. So you ask me about the gap. What is it that we still need to address? And I think it is the underlying social and economic structure, the class, caste, and gender biases or discrimination that are there in society. Let me give a counter example which may help. If you take Japan's path of development, when we study economic development, we look at trajectories of different countries. Or later you take South Korea, or more, even later you take China. What is common among some of these Asian countries who are our neighbors, who were able to go on a path from a low income to a developed country or middle high income path? And that was certain basic changes, such as land reform, such as quality education for all, such as breaking down some gender biases and other barriers. Okay, caste is unique to India, but there are other kinds of social barriers in other countries too. So to lift everybody up. Okay, that is, so whether it's a girl child or a boy child, you give the same quality education. Okay, and perhaps we see some of that in the urban areas, but I think that's why I say you need to go to the rural to see that some of these problems are persisting. And so, unless we deal with this underlying inequalities in our society, we have many achievements, but their impact is unequal. We have brilliant technologies, brilliant policymakers, brilliant policies, but how they actually reach the ground is in a very unequal and differentiated way.
Right.
So it's not one policy or one technology that I see as a solution. We need many, but I think we have to recognize that we have an underlying problem that South Korea addressed in a different way, Japan addressed in a different way, China addressed through a revolution. So there are slightly different ways in which they addressed it, but they all brought about a kind of transformation of the rural areas of their country, which we have not yet undertaken, with a few exceptions, small exceptions here and there.
Moving on to the next question. With rapid advancements in AI, remote sensing, and digital agriculture, there's both excitement and concern. From your perspective, how are these tools reshaping food systems and livelihoods? And are these innovations you are particularly excited about or perhaps skeptical of?
Uh, I think innovations that are coming are great. So I'm positive about them. And given the concerns that we have, which is we want to increase productivity and production to be able to feed our population. We want to be able to increase incomes of those who are the cultivators or growers. And we want to do it in the context of climate change. I think science and new innovations and technology have to be relied on. So without that, we won't be able to overcome all these challenges. And let me just give one or two examples. Very recently, India has released, the Indian official system has released the first ever CRISPR rice variety. It's not just the first ever CRISPR rice variety in India, it's the first ever CRISPR rice variety in the world. So I think some of our innovations are also innovations for the world. They're not just innovations for agricultural science in India. And these varieties will be able to address drought tolerance, and they won't have the problems that some people are worried about in GMOs. It's just gene editing. So you're not bringing in some external um, body into a plant. It is modifying the plant's genes. The other thing is look at AI, look at digital technologies, drone technologies. All these can help with what we call precision farming. So, how can a small farmer use less inputs, which will be both healthy for the soil but also cost less and get more output? So, if you can tell me ways in which I can have sensors which can tell me the water level required or the nutrient that is missing in soil, then I don't need to have a blanket application of fertilizer or blanket watering of the field. I can be precise, and in that way, I can save resources both the natural resources as well as the cost to the farmer, and get better output. So I think there are so many things which are happening. These are all very exciting. Uh, and but I think again to underline my point, we have internet connectivity, but do we have Wi-Fi in every field? Mobile phone usage has gone up in a very big way in India. But does every woman, because increasingly it's women who are in the farming, the men are migrating to the cities. Does every rural woman have a mobile phone? I don't think so. I think for men, we can say 90% or so have a phone. Hmm? So these is what I'm talking about. They're very new, exciting technologies. But when we bring them about, when we apply them, when we think of policies, we have to be aware of the underlying inequalities in access to these technologies.
On to the next question. Um, Many of our listeners come from technical backgrounds. From your experience, what are some meaningful ways for them to engage with the challenges you describe? And could you share a story or experience where cross disciplinary collaboration actually made a difference?
Yes, as I said uh, a little earlier, one of the things India needs to do is invest more in science and R&D and technology innovation. As a share of our agricultural GDP, what we invest in science and R&D is very small. It may be also for industry, but I'm concerned about agriculture compared to other countries, compared to China, for instance. I'm not comparing ourselves with the US or some very highly advanced country. So all fields of agricultural science, I already mentioned things like AI and drone, but very big problem in India is food waste. And where the food waste happens is after it's produced and in the what we call post-harvest or storage. By the time the apples reach from Kashmir to Bangalore where I live, they're all darkened, they've got all kinds of problems. So, storage materials, what are the kind of transport options and transport materials, refrigeration? There are so many things. It's not just drones and AI, but I think there's a vast array of things that need to be done because this will keep the produce longer, it will not lead to waste, and it will also give higher income to the person who's selling. But I want to give you one example of really interdisciplinary work that I know of. And this is a project which has been running now for about 30 years, which was started by my father in a region of Tamil Nadu called the Kolli Hills. It's a small block, which is a very poor block and with a very high tribal population. But it's also a region of millet cultivation and millet diversity. So, foxtail millet, kodo millet, there's a range of millets. And millets, as some of you may know, we know in the cities now are being promoted as very nutrient dense crops.
Yeah.
So climate friendly, they're hardy crops. So the idea of the project was, how do we encourage millet cultivation? How do we preserve the millet biodiversity? But at the same time, you have to ensure higher incomes for those who are growing, better technology, less drudgery. So in this project, there were social workers who were looking at how to encourage people to form groups, how women self-help groups in particular, to encourage cultivation. There were plant breeders and agronomists looking at what seed varieties can we bring in, what agronomic practices that we can bring in that would give higher yields. So there were participatory field trials. Then there was a very important intervention in agricultural engineering because the mills or the chakkis which are used for rice and wheat are not so suitable for uh, millets. And so there was a customization of small mill machinery which can reduce the extent of broken grains and also keep more bran on the grain because that's more healthy. And this machinery manufacturers in Tamil Nadu actually are selling across the country. But these were small scale, so they could be available uh, closer to home for this poor community, the tribal farmers of this region. Associated with this milling, it was very important because the traditional milling method was women pounding the grain after it's harvested. Now that's very laborious, very time consuming. very hard energy that is utilized. And so this was actually freeing up time, reducing the drudgery of women. And the last part of the project was getting home science departments involved in how to develop products which are easier to cook, have a longer shelf life, because millets don't have the shelf life of rice and wheat, and can bring more income to the farmers. So, millet dosa mixes. I mean, if you go to a supermarket today, this sounds like something everybody does, but it's a whole process.
Yeah.
So, millet upma mix or millet flour, even, so that uh, it's easier to cook and consume. Because even in the rural area, the woman who has to cook for her family before she leaves for work cannot be pounding and then soaking and then boiling something for 2 hours. You want something which is easier to cook. So this project, the millet story, if you like, for the Kolli Hills of Tamil Nadu, was really, I think, one example of a micro project uh, which was interdisciplinary and no major, huge, big innovation, but lots of minor interventions and innovations. Uh, so I thought that would be interesting to share
Yeah, it was quite.
audience.
And also, this was initiated by our father, right?
That's right. Yeah, the Miss Swaminathan Research Foundation.
Moving on to the next question. You have spent years immersed in both academic spaces and engaged with grassroots actors. How do you stay connected to ground realities? Has that connection ever surprised you or changed the course of your research?
I must be very clear. I'm an academic. I'm not an activist. But having said that, I think I've learned a lot and really been inspired by my interactions with activists, particularly women activists.
Mm.
On the left in movements such as the Janavadi Mahila Sanghatna and the All India Democratic Women's Association, and who have together, I think, a membership of perhaps about 1 million women or more. And I can give an example of how it has influenced me and my work. As you know, one of the areas I'm very interested in is food security. And in 2013, India passed a landmark act, the National Food Security Act, just giving a legal right to food. And it's quite unique among countries of the world. I think, other than Brazil, no other country world has a right to food enacted by Parliament. But in the run up to this passing of the act, there was a lot of mobilization of different kinds. Many of us were writing articles about what was the importance of food security, what was importance of making something like our ration system, our public distribution system universal, of expanding its reach and coverage, of expanding the commodities that we gave in it, some of which happened in some states during COVID, and I can talk about that later. But I think the Supreme Court played a role. So different parties played a role when something big like this change comes about. But I think one very important component of this, and perhaps not recognized in academic literature because it is activist work, was organization by women's groups, particularly by ADWA. And there are a variety of things that they did, and I participated in some of them, many of them, but obviously they did many more, which was organize uh, events in different parts of the country with their women members and others, mobilize them in small gathering, bring out pamphlets about what is the importance of food security and what was needed in this act, have protest marches, gatherings, Jan Sunwais, conferences, uh, some of which, like national conference, which they held in Delhi, some of which I participated in. And when you hear from women on the ground, because in India, all said and done, it's still women who are responsible for putting the food on the table. Not just cooking it, but ensuring that the family has a meal. And often they eat last, they make sure that their children, the men, have eaten. So if food prices go up, women know immediately their budget is affected. Okay, if food is scarce. So when there is inflation, so against the need for stable food prices, not just for 5 kilos in the ration, but also food security in other ways. is when I went to some of these events and participated and heard the voices of women speaking from different parts of the country and how they were. And these are women who may be agricultural workers, they may be working in the informal sector, a variety of people, largely from the working class. It's very inspiring to see how, despite all their day to day problems, they're ready to spend time to come and speak about something which is a national act. And I think this has fed into my work and the importance of the kinds of issues that one should research. Uh, so I think that interaction is. Uh, I hope some of the ideas I gave them were helpful, but I think more important for me is what I learned from them.
On to the next question. Um, Looking at the broader picture, what do you think is the most pressing challenge for the next generation when it comes to food systems and rural livelihoods? And what should we be paying attention to, even if it's not making headlines yet?
Okay. Now, I'll start with a quote from Amartya Sen, which is he said, India has ended starvation. Many years ago, he said, but not chronic hunger. What is chronic hunger is basically people not having enough adequate diets, malnutrition. This is what we're saying chronic hunger. Whereas starvation and famine, starvation deaths, as we're seeing in Gaza today, or we've seen in Ethiopia. The last famine in India was the West Bengal famine of 1943. So pre-independence. So independent India has not had a famine. He was, of course, comparing us to China. But we have chronic hunger on a mass scale. And one of the arguments he makes is because the media focuses on issues such as starvation death or wars or crises or floods. When there's a major event of that kind, the news media is everywhere.
We focus on negative news.
Not just negative, it's a big event.
Yeah.
When there's an everyday hunger, when we say, and I'm going to tell you this number is going to shock you, 72% of Indians cannot afford a healthy diet. That's about 1,000 million people in India cannot afford a healthy diet. This is not in the news. You've not heard this number, have you? So this everyday hunger of different kinds, I'll define it in a minute, is something which is not in the headlines, but which needs to be in the headlines. We need to look at it.
Definitely.
Let me step back a minute here. There are different ways to measure chronic hunger, poverty, malnutrition. All these things are related, but slightly different. But in the last few years, the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, has come up with a indicator they call cost of a healthy diet. And by healthy diet, they mean not just the calories needed, which are different for men, women, children, pregnant women, depending on the kind of physical labor you're doing. Not just the total calories that you need, but the protein, the fat, the micronutrients, the iron, the vitamin C, B, whatever, all these components, what are called macro and micronutrients by nutritionists. And you must get these protein, calories, nutrients through multiple food groups. So I can't just say no, only rice or at most rice and dal, and that's all you can have. You have to have vegetables, fruits, nuts, pulses, animal foods. If you so, this is for an urban dweller, probably this is something that you comes from your you're told at home that don't eat the vegetables, eat the fruit, etc. So what they have worked out is the cost based on the national ICMR norms, Indian norms. So they take the Indian norm and they say, okay, what is the cost of getting your minimum calories and minimum all these nutrients, eating from all these food groups. And in fact, I think they leave out animal proteins because those are more expensive, as we know. Having chicken or fish is going to be more expensive. And on that basis, they work out the cost of a healthy diet. And they worked it out to be, in the 2023 report for the first time, to be about $4 a day. whereas the official World Bank poverty line that India uses is about $2 a day. That's why you may wonder why I'm saying 72%. And they work out, this may be a little rough estimate, we can modify it, but roughly what they're saying is 70% of the Indian population cannot afford a healthy diet. And I think this is a very, very serious issue. And so I think for me, this is the biggest challenge, if you like. And it's a challenge, again, for people working in different disciplines. It's not just a challenge for nutritionists or economists or something. Let me just give an example to end here. So, if we want our population, the Indian population, to have a healthy diet, it means that on the production side, we are lucky we have adequate production of cereals, of rice and wheat in particular. But we need to make sure we have production of fruits, of vegetables, of milk, of fish, of all the other things as well that would go into the nutritious diet.
Okay.
We need to ensure that we have adequate production of a variety of food crops, including millets, including fruit, vegetables. So that will require research. And as I said, all the other sciences and technologies to come in that would contribute to the production side. And on the other side, production, and when you say production, I mean production on the farm, proper transport, distribution, ensuring we have safe and healthy food at the retail end for the consumer. On the other side, and I think this is again the most perhaps for young people like you will be aware, is one of the biggest challenges. How do we make sure everyone can afford this healthy diet?
Yeah.
And I think that is the challenge of employment and incomes, okay, of livelihoods. That one is, as agricultural scientists and researchers, how do we ensure adequate production and that the production is not wasted and that the production is available and so on. But then how do you ensure that people have the income to buy it? Uh, I don't think there's a very simple answer, but I think if you look at it in this way, that the cost of a healthy diet is ensuring everybody in India has a healthy diet, means ensuring we have production, that these commodities are available at a reasonable price, and ensuring that people have incomes to buy those commodities.
If you could offer one piece of advice to someone who wants to create meaningful change regardless of their background, what would it be? Perhaps something you wish you had heard when you were starting out.
I don't think young people want advice from me, but I just say this, that do something that interests you if you can. I mean, if the choices are available to you, do something that you can work hard on. But whatever you take up, you have to commit time to it, because I think many of the changes, the innovations that we talk about come from hard work. It's not that there's some people, of course, who are geniuses, but I think everybody can contribute. And if you work hard at something and you commit time to it, you're making a contribution. So I think that that is, the main piece of advice I give to young people. Don't do something because X said it's good or Y said parents said something that you want to do. And the second, I think, as an Indian, I will say, of course, you have to do something that brings you adequate income, that you feel comfortable with, that you have your basic, all your needs taken care of. But as an Indian, I think we have to have to some commitment to the larger public good.
Yes.
We have very big challenges in our country. And so it doesn't have to be at the start of your career, it can be later. But I think that's something that you need to be aware of. For a young person, that's all I'll say. I won't make them, change their career right now.
Mm, definitely. We'll all try to keep that in mind. So, um, moving on, we have a rapid fire round in slow for you. So you just have to answer whatever comes to your mind, the first thought. So starting before, if you had a superpower while doing field work, what would it be?
I think of photographic memory. Remember the faces, fields, houses,
Okay.
Yeah.
One word to describe the future of agriculture in India.
Challenging.
Okay. Then a book that changed your perspective, maybe as a student or early researcher.
I think Sen, Amartya Sen, Poverty and Famines.
Okay. And a myth about food security you wish more people would stop believing.
Myth about food security. I think that India is food secure. We have food secure in terms of production, but I think that's something that is a myth here.
Okay. One habit that keeps you grounded to your work.
Meeting young people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice to know. If not this path, economics and rural development, what do you think you might have pursued instead?
Anthropology.
Okay.
Mm.
And if you could teleport to any rural place you have worked in just for the food, where would you go?
Oh, West Bengal, no doubt. And in the mango season.
Okay. Nice. What's the best question a student has ever asked you? The one that really made you pause and rethink.
I think it's how do we create jobs? How do we create good jobs? I think that's a tough question. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay. So that was fantastic. Thanks for playing along. And more importantly, thank you for this deep, meaningful conversation. Any final thoughts you might have to say to our public, to say to our community?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed speaking to you. And, I was going to say this earlier, but I'll say something that, again, is a concept from Amartya Sen, what he calls public action from above and public action from below. Some people get to be in government, make policies, they're IAS officers, whatever. That's public action from above, the ministers, etc., advisors. But change comes about from public action from below also, through our panchayats, through civil society, through the kinds of women's activists I was talking about. So I think this is very important that uh, change can come about from public action from below as well as from above. We don't wait for change only from above. So let me end by thanking TEDx at IIT Gandhinagar for talking to me. I really enjoyed this interaction.
So, today's conversation reminded us that technology is not just about speed or scale, it's about serving lives, especially those too often overlooked. It was indeed an insightful conversation where we understood not just what innovation looks like, but who it should serve. Because the generations reaching for the skies must also remember the roots that nourish them. This has been TEDx Conversations, Season 3, Episode 3. This was an idea worth spreading. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone curious about the future of food, equity, or tech that truly matters. Until next time, keep listening, keep listening. Thank you.